Good afternoon. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We're going to continue in our book reading of The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond, and we are in Chapter 3. The founding of the company. The Society of Jesus was constituted on Assumption Day in 1534 in the chapel of Notre Dame in de Montemarti. Ignatius was then 44 years old. After communion, the animator and his companions vowed to go to the Holy Land as soon as their studies were finished to convert the infidels. The following year found them in Rome, where the Pope, who then organizing a crusade against the Turks with the German Emperor and the Republic of Venice, showed them how impossible their project was because of it. So Ignatius and his companions dedicated themselves to missionary work in Christian lands. In Venice, his apostolate roused again the suspicions of the Inquisition. The Constitution of the Company of Jesus was at last drafted and approved by Rome by Paul III in 1540, and the Jesuits put themselves at the disposition of the Pope, promising him unconditional obedience. Teaching, confession, preaching, and charitable work were the field of action for this new order. But foreign missions were not excluded, as in 1541 Francis Xavier and two companions left Lisbon to go evangelize the Far East. In 1546, the political side of their career was launched when the Pope chose Lainez and Salmeron to represent him at the Council of Trent in the capacity of the pontifical theologians. Mr. Boehmer writes, then the order was employed by the Pope only on a temporary basis, but it performed its functions with so much promptitude and zeal that already under Pope Paul III it had implanted itself very firmly into all chosen kinds of activities and won the confidence of the cura for all time. This confidence was fully justified. The Jesuits, and Lainez in particular, together with their devoted friend Cardinal Moroni, became the cunning and untiring champions of pontifical authority and intelligibility of the dogma. During 3 sessions of that council ending in 1562. By their clever maneuvers and dialectics, they succeeded in defeating the opposition in all heretic claims, including marriage of priests, communion with the two elements, use of the vernacular in services, and, especially, reform of the papacy. Only the reform of convents was retained on the agenda. Lainez himself, by a forceful counter-attack, held pontifical infallibility, which was promulgated 3 centuries later by the Vatican Council. The Holy See emerged, strengthened from the crisis where it nearly foundered, thanks to the steadfastness actions of the Jesuits. The terms chosen by Paul III to describe this new order in his bull of authorization were then amply justified. Regime Ecclesiastis Militianis. I can't pronounce that myself. It's Italian, I think. The fighting spirit developed more and more as time went on. Beside foreign missions, the activities of the Loyola sons started to concentrate on the souls of men, especially amongst ruling classes. Politics are their main field of action, as all the efforts of these directors concentrate on one aim, the submission of the world to the papacy, and to attain this the heads must be conquered first. And to realize this ideal, 2 very important weapons: to be the confessors of the mighty and those in high places, and the education of their children. In that way, the present will be safe while the future is prepared. The Holy See soon realized the strength of this new order would bring. At first, the number of its members had been limited to 60, but this restriction was promptly lifted. When Ignatius died in 1556, his sons were working amongst pagans in India, China, Japan, the New World, but also and especially in Europe, France, southern and western Germany, where they fought against the heresy in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even England, getting in by way of Ireland. Their history, full of vicissitudes, will be of a Roman network they will constantly try to spread over the world, whose links will be forever torn and mended. Chapter 4. The Spirit of the Order. Let us not forget, writes the Jesuit Roquette, that historically ultramontanism has been the practical affirmation of universalism. This necessary universalism would be an empty word if it did not result in a practical cohesion or obedience of Christianity. This is why Ignatius wanted this team to be at the disposition of the Pope and be the champion of Catholic unity, unity which can be assured only through an effective submission to Christ's vicar. The Jesuits wanted to impose this monarchical absolutism on the Roman Church, and they maintained it in civil society, as they had to look upon the sovereigns as temporal representatives of the Holy Father, true head of Christianity. As long as those monarchs were entirely docile to their common Lord, the Jesuits were their most faithful supporters. On the other hand, if these princes rebelled, they found in the Jesuits their worst enemies. In Europe, wherever Rome's interests required the people to rise against their king, or if these temporal princes had taken decisions embarrassing for the church, the cura knew she would not find more able, cunning, or daring outside the society of Jesus when it came to intrigue, propaganda, or even open rebellion. We have seen through the spirit of the exercises how the founder of this company was behind his time in his simplistic mysticism, ecclesiastical discipline, and, generally speaking, his conception of subordination. The constitutions and exercises fundamentals to this system leave us without any doubt on that subject. No matter what his disciples may say, especially today, as modern ideas on this subject are totally different, obedience has a very special place. In fact, incontestably, the first in the summary of the order's rules. Mr. Follett may pretend to see it nothing more than religious obedience necessary to any congregation. R. P. Roquette writes boldly, far from being a diminution of men, this intelligent and willing obedience is the height of freedom, a liberation from one's bondage. One only has to read those texts to perceive the extreme, if not monstrous, character of this submission of soul and spirit imposed to the Jesuits, making them always a docile instruments in their superiors' hands, and even more from their very beginning the natural enemies of any kind of liberty. The famous "as a corpse in the undertaker's hand" can be found in all spiritual literature, according to Mr. Follett, and even in the East. In the Haitian's constitution, the Jesuits are to be in the hand of their superiors, as a staff obeying every impulse, as a ball of wax which can be shaped and stretched in any direction, as a small crucifix being lifted and moved at will. These pleasant formulas are none the less very enlightening. Remarks and explanations from the creator of this order leave us without any doubt as to their true meanings. Besides, amongst the Jesuits, not only the will, but also reasoning and even moral scruple must be sacrificed to the primordial virtue of obedience, which is, according to Borgia, the strongest rampart of society. Let us be convinced that all is well and right when the superior commands it, writes Loyola. And again, even if God gave you an animal without sense for master, you will not hesitate to obey him as master and guide, because God ordained it to be so. And something even better, the Jesuit must see in his superior not a fallible man, but Christ himself. J. Huber, professor of Catholic theology in Munich and author of one of the most important works on the Jesuits, wrote, "Here is a proven fact. The constitutions repeat 500 times that one must see Christ in the person of the general." The disciples of the order, assimilated so often to that of the army, is then nothing compared to the reality. Military obedience is not the equivalent of Jesuitic obedience. The latter is more extensive as it gets hold of the whole man and is not satisfied like the other with an exterior act, but requires the sacrifice of the will and laying aside of one's own judgment. Ignatius wrote in his letter to the Portuguese Jesuits, "We must see black as white, if the church says so. Such is this height of freedom and liberation from one's own bondage, praised earlier by R.P. Roquette. Indeed, the Jesuit is truly liberated from himself, as he is totally subjected to his masters. Any doubt or scruple would be imputed to him as sin." Mr. Beaumere wrote, "In the additions to the constitutions, the superiors are advised to command the novices, as God did with Abraham, things apparently criminal to them to prove them, but they must proportion these temptations to each one's strength. Fact, they are monks living in the world, and outwardly nothing distinguishes them from the secular clergy. But, contrary to this and other religious congregations, they are not subjected to the bishop's authority." As early as 1545, a bull of Paul II enabled them to preach, hear confession, dispense the sacraments, and say Mass. In short, exercise their ministry without having to refer to the bishop. The solemnization of marriages is the only thing they are not allowed to perform. They have the power to give absolution, change vows for others which are easier to fulfill, or even cancel them. Mr. Gaston Bally writes, "The general's power concerning absolution and dispensations is even wider. He can lift all punishment inflicted on the members of the society before or after them entering the order, absolve all their sins, even the sin of heresy and schism and falsification of apostolic writings, etc. The general absolves in person or through a delegate all those who are under his obedience of the unhappy state arising from excommunication, suspension, or interdict, provided these censures were not inflicted for excesses so enormous that others, beside the papal tribunal, knew about them. He also absolves the irregularity issuing from bigamy, injuries done to others, murder, assassinations, as long as these wicked deeds were not publicly known and the cause of a scandal." Finally, Gregory XIII bestowed on the company the right to deal in commerce and not baking, a right it made use of extensively later on. These dispensations and unprecedented powers were fully granted to them. The popes called even upon princes and kings to defend these privileges. They threatened with the great excommunication, latae sensienti, all those who would try to infringe them. In 1574, a bull of Pius V gave the general the right to restore these privileges to their original scope against all attempts to alter or curtail them, even if such curtailments were authoritatively documented by papal revocation. By granting the Jesuits such exorbitant privileges, which run counter to the Church's antiquated constitution, the papacy wanted not only to supply them with powerful weapons to fight the infidels, but especially use them as a bodyguard to defend her unrestricted power in the Church and against the Church. To preserve the spiritual and temporal supremacy they usurped during the Middle Ages, the Pope sold the Church to the order of Jesuits, and in consequence surrendered themselves into their hands. If the papacy was supported by the Jesuits, the whole existence of the Jesuits depended on the spiritual and temporal supremacy of the papacy. In that way, the interests of both parties were intimately bound together. But this select cohort needed secret auxiliaries to dominate civil society. This role fell on those affiliated to the company called Jesuits. Many important people were connected in that way with the society. The emperors Ferdinand II and III, Sigismund III, King of Poland, who had officially belonged to the company, Cardinal Infant, a Duke of Savoy, and these were not the least useful. It is the same today. The 33,000 official members of the society operate all over the world in the capacity of her personal officers of a truly secret army containing in its ranks heads of political parties, high-ranking officials, generals, magistrates, physicians, faculty professors, etc., all of them striving to bring about in their own sphere Opus Dei, I think that means God's work in reality, the plans of the papacy. How interesting, Nikki.
I've got some interesting stuff.
All right. Do you want me to close it out then? Okay. Well, I'm going to end that there. Next time, we will pick it up in section 2, and that is entitled The Jesuits in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Until then, take everything to the Lord in prayer. Seek his face for wisdom and understanding. I love you all so very, very much. Keep your eyes on Jesus, your nose in the book, which is the Word of God, and embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts so you will not sin against God. Be blessed, brothers and sisters. I love you all. Bye-bye.